Hello Internet, and welcome to Nostalgia Philosopher, the show where I extract the philosophical content from 80s and 90s pop culture, and then, through a series of crude honking noises, express my academic disapproval. Sort of like a mashup between Jim Carrey's Riddler and those golden egg evaluation thingies from the lab in Willy Wonka's factory.
Bad egg.
Haha, bad egg indeed, bad egg. Today we're going to talk about...
Flight of Dragon.
Created by the same animation studio that gave us The Last Unicorn and the animated version of The Hobbit, Flight of Dragons tells the story of Peter Dickinson, a 20th century scientist and overall fantasy nerd who spends his spare time writing a work of speculative science about how dragons would work if they were real. Appropriately enough, his speculative work is called Flight of Dragons. Peter's world turns upside down when he is magically summoned to a time long ago when dragons existed. He is summoned there by the green wizard Cornelius, so called because he presides all over nature and its greenery. By the way, what is it with wizards and having colors in their title? I mean, in Tolkien's works, we have Gandalf the Grey and Gandalf the White and Saruman the White and that Jar Jar Binks guy who's the brown wizard. And in this movie, we end up having 4 color-coded wizards too. Cornelius is the green one, but then of course you've got...
My brother Solarius is the blue wizard, lord of the depths and the heights. His realm is outer space, deepest ocean, highest mountain.
And then you've got the golden one.
And my brother Lotajal, the golden wizard. His realm is light and air.
And of course you've got the evil red one.
Finally, high and loathly tower, my last brother, Omadon, the red wizard, lord of the devil's domain.
Red is always bad, I guess. Anyway, Cornelius uses his favorite magic word to do absolutely everything.
Kala! 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 Kala!
It's kind of funny because the word kala is just good in ancient Greek. And he also says a bunch of inconsistent things about what magic is.
Inevitability is the strongest magic of all. Imagination is the most potent of all magic.
Seriously, inevitability and imagination are both the most powerful magic? Does that mean that inevitability is imagination? Well, that doesn't sound right, because surely you can imagine things that aren't inevitable. And upon meeting the first female character in the film, Cornelius helps Peter don a magic fedora and act like an utter creep. Peter finds out that he's supposed to go on a quest with Cornelius's dragon Gorbash in order to steal the red crown of Omadon and stop Omadon from destroying the world. But then, through a magical accident, Peter's soul actually gets trapped in Gorbash's body, so that you've got Peter's mind in the body of a dragon.
By the beards of antiquity, I went and merged them.
Merged?
Peter and Gorbash are one. Peter is in Gorbash.
Okay, so there are only 3 ways to even begin to explain how this is possible, and only one of them actually works out into a coherent, sensible story. Here's the first option. We can say that Peter's brain has been magically transported inside of Gorbash's skull, while Gorbash's brain, along with Peter's body, are transported elsewhere. Since Peter's thoughts, emotions, memories, and in short, his whole identity are realized in his brain, the transportation of Peter's brain into Gorbash leaves Peter in the body of a dragon. Okay, here's 2 reasons why that's wrong. First of all, despite its inclusion of wizards and magic, Flight of Dragons goes out of its way to provide a detailed, scientifically realistic perspective on what dragon physiology would have to be like.
It's like birds use grit to grind seed.
Whenever something about dragons is established, there's always a character there to provide a scientific explanation for the audience.
Because dragons tend to ignite ordinary bedding, they must find a soft metal to sleep on.
They go into so much detail that, really, when the characters discuss dragons, it's more like a science fiction movie than a fantasy movie.
Limestone is high in calcium. Calcium, when mixed with stomach acids, would form hydrogen. The hydrogen expands and makes us lighter than air and...
So, allowing for human-to-dragon brain transplants would go against the movie's own rules and undermine that perspective. More importantly, even if Peter's brain went into Gorbash's body, that wouldn't conclusively establish that we end up with Peter in a new body. Alternatively, one could establish that, after the accident, we have Gorbash, just Gorbash, with a new brain. One could argue, in other words, that we still have Gorbash, but that Gorbash has undergone a brain transplant, much as you might undergo a liver or a heart transplant. Yes, it's true that after the accident, Gorbash has all of Peter's memories, and he even says that he's Peter, but what do you expect when you get a new brain? People who get brain transplants, goes the argument, may temporarily forget who they are and claim to be someone else, but that doesn't mean that they are someone else. In short, if Peter's brain were in Gorbash's body, we would have to settle a philosophical debate about identity, about whether it goes along with the brain or whether it goes along with the rest of the body. And that philosophical debate is not settled in any quick or obvious way. Here's the second option for making sense of this story. The second option is that Gorbash keeps his original brain, but that it gets magically reshaped and reconfigured so that it realizes the exact same states as Peter's brain. As a result, we get a creature who can think like Peter, feel like Peter, recall Peter's experiences, and so on, but who has the body of Gorbash, a dragon. Thus, we get Peter in the body of a dragon. Okay, the major reason why that's wrong is that taking Gorbash's brain and reconfiguring it so that it behaves like the brain of Peter is not the same thing as actually having Peter there. If you reconfigure Gorbash's brain, that just means that Gorbash has a brain injury so severe and so specific that he thinks he's someone else. So in the end, the process of reconfiguring Gorbash's brain would just leave us with Gorbash and no Peter at all. The only other option that remains, and this may have been obvious from the very start, is to say that Flight of Dragons does not take place in a materialistic universe. Rather, we say every living creature, or perhaps every creature with a mind, has an immaterial soul, and that the soul houses their consciousness, their thoughts, their memories, and all their mental activity. This immaterial soul is separable from the body, maybe even persists after the body's destruction and death, and that, in the magical accident with Cornelius and Peter, Peter's soul was transported inside of Gorbash's body. That's the only explanation that would make sense. Peter goes on the quest anyway, inside a dragon's body, and as he does so, he applies the scientific knowledge that he's learned to learn about how dragons work.
Grind up the white fire rock when you eat it.
That's limestone.
In the end, he uses his knowledge of science to save the day.
What is that slime? Dark magic, that's what. Dark magic.
Maybe. But it's also a highly corrosive acid, much stronger than anything I ever ran into at the lab.
As expected in a typical patriarchal fantasy narrative, he also gets the girl. Now, I loved this movie as a child. Between the ages of 5 and 8, I must have watched it every single weekend. The animation is beautiful, and the soundtrack is absolutely memorable. Philosophically, however, the most interesting thing in Flight of Dragons happens rather early in the film, when Peter visits Cornelius's library. It's a very special sort of magical library.
This is my library of unwritten books. See? Beowulf, The Idylls of the King, Gulliver's Travels, The Tempest, Alice in Wonderland, The Wizard of Oz.
Now, if you recall, Peter, when he was whisked away on his magical journey, was in the middle of writing a book about dragons. He wasn't finished with it yet, he was hoping to finish it. But there, in Cornelius's library, is a finished copy of the book.
Here it is, The Flight of Dragons by Peter Dickinson.
It's impossible. That's not even half finished.
He tries to read it, hoping to plagiarize its latter contents for his own purposes and finish the book more easily.
No fair peeking at the end.
Now, there's a whole lot of interesting things you could ask about the nature of this library. For one thing, does it establish that there's such a thing as fate, and that certain authors' choices are predetermined? After all, if there's a fact about which books they will write, it seems as if, somehow, no matter what they do, they're going to end up writing those books that are in Cornelius's library. Even weirder than that, though, is if we think about what would have happened if Peter decided to look at the latter half of his own book in Cornelius's library, the half that he hadn't finished yet, look at its pages, remember them, and then write them down when he got home, so that he wouldn't have to go to the trouble of thinking of it himself. If Peter were to do that, we would get a philosophical puzzle. Here's how. First, consider Peter Dickinson from the 20th century. This is the Peter who gets summoned from the 20th century, goes back to the time of Cornelius, learns about the quest, goes on the quest after visiting Cornelius's library, and then goes back home. Then consider Peter after all of those adventures take place. Call Peter at this point 21st century Peter. 21st century Peter is the one who has the finished version of the book, Flight of Dragons. 21st century Peter is the one who finished it. But when we ask 21st century Peter, right after he published his book, hey, where did you get the ideas for the second half of that book? He will have to tell us, well, when I was younger in the 20th century, I went back in time to a library and I copied a book there. And if we ask, well, how did the book there get its content? Where did that come from? Where did the information come from to put in the latter half of that book? He will have to say, oh, that book is just a copy of the one that I just finished writing here in the 21st century. If that doesn't seem crazy to you, let me put it like this. The book in Cornelius's library is just a copy of the one from the 21st century. It's copied from the 21st century. However, the one in the 21st century, thanks to Peter's actions, is just copied from the one in the library. So Cornelius's copy is copied from Peter's, and Peter's copy is copied from Cornelius's. So how on earth did the information get into the universe in the first place? If Peter had no idea what he was writing, and he was just copying from Cornelius's volume, and Cornelius's volume was composed just by copying Peter's with no knowledge of its contents, that means that nobody knew anything about the dragons that they were writing about. How on earth could the book have been written? I guess this is why it's such a fortunate thing that Cornelius stops Peter from reading the second half.
No fair peeking at the end.
And then he changes the topic to talk about weapons or something more appropriate for a fantasy quest. Good thing, huh? But it seems like a close call. If Cornelius didn't intervene, we would have had that weird temporal absurdity. Now, if you think this sounds silly and that I'm just forcing some philosophical content into one of my favorite cartoons, you're half right, but also actually wrong. It turns out this particular sort of thing is a puzzle in the philosophy of time. Although philosophers don't really talk about Flight of Dragons, unfortunately, they do talk a lot about this particular puzzle. In the philosophy of time, it's known as a problem of causal loops. It sort of goes like this. One day, you receive the instructions on how to build a time machine from a mysterious stranger. You follow the instructions to the letter. Then, you use the time machine that you ended up building to go back in time where, disguised as a mysterious stranger, you give your younger self instructions on how to build that very time machine. So you've got a causal loop there. There's no paradox in the sense of there being a kill-your-own-grandfather type of thing. No, it's coherent in that way. But what's absurd is where the information came from on how to build the time machine. The past self got it from the future self got it from the past self. So who the hell had it originally? How did the information get into the universe? That's the problem that we would have had if Cornelius let Peter look at the latter half of Flight of Dragons in his library, instead of snatching it out of his hand and changing the topic to talk about a magical shield and flute and stuff. Anyway, that's the interesting philosophical puzzle in the movie Flight of Dragons. And that's pretty much all there is to say about the movie now, other than to note that it has the cutest baby dragon ever! Aw, look at that guy! Also, it's pretty funny that Peter just pronounces the names of a bunch of sciences in order to defeat an evil wizard.
Come algebra, anatomy, astronomy, biology, chemistry, geology, geometry, mathematics, meteorology, mineralogy, oceanography, paleontology, physics, psychology, sociology, trigonometry, and zoology.
Anyway, I'll see you next time when maybe we talk about, Thundercats or something? Thanks for watching.